And with that, it looks like we are live and on YouTube. Hello, everyone. It's wonderful to be with you out there on this Thursday evening, or whichever evening you happen to be watching this if you're not watching live. It's great to be with you. My name is John Lustria. I'm the education coordinator at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. And we're very excited to present another wonderful presentation brought to you by the Frederick County Civil War Roundtable. I'll turn things over to Matt here in just a second, but I want to say if you enjoy tonight's video or any other videos the museum or the roundtable have done, go ahead and like this video, share this video, subscribe to the National Museum of Civil War Medicine on YouTube, like us on Facebook, and all that good stuff to stay up to date with everything that we do. And if at any point during the program you have any questions, go ahead and drop them in the comments, and at the end of the presentation, we'll get to all the questions. I see we already got some people tuning in. Todd Morris says hello. Derek says nice. So we've already got some people tuning in. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Matt. Take us away.
Excellent. Thank you, John. Welcome, everyone, once again to the Frederick County Civil War Roundtable. My name is Matt Borders. I'm the president of the Roundtable, and we want to thank, as always, our host and facilitator for this, the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. So John's been a huge help to us during this trying season, and we're continuing with these digital programs throughout it. Now, tonight we have a very special guest. A number of you have commented on how excited you are about this topic, and we're very, very pleased to present David Dixon. He's coming to us all the way from California this evening, and he is going to be speaking on a more obscure character of the war. Many of us are familiar with, of course, Abraham Lincoln and the Gettysburg Address, and Everett, who also spoke there, but most of us, including myself, are not familiar with Charles Anderson, a Kentucky Unionist who was also at the Gettysburg Address. And David's going to be speaking to us tonight about that topic. So without further ado, let me turn it over to him, and we will get started. So thank you, everyone, for joining us, and thank you for being with us tonight, David.
All right. Well, thank you, Matt. It's great to be here, and I really appreciate you inviting me. I think I will share my screen now and get that first presentation up. Here we go. Let me just move my menu bar so I can get to the slideshow. All right. Here we go. Can you see that okay?
Yes, sir.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you again for having me. Really excited to be here and share this unusual story with you. One of the things that makes history so exciting for me really are all the new discoveries that keep popping up on a regular basis. For example, who knew that we would find the bones of Richard III underneath the parking lot in the middle of England? Or that we would also find an original parchment copy of the Declaration of Independence at a small courthouse in England. So even with an iconic moment like Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, there are still fresh discoveries to be had. Now, many scholars know, as Matt mentioned, that there were actually 3 featured speakers on November 19th, 1863. Edward Everett's 2-hour oration, which he delivered from memory, has been basically forgotten amid this long shadow cast by Lincoln's immortal 2-minute address. Well, Lincoln, Secretary of State Seward, and all the important dignitaries attended the 3rd speech of the day later that afternoon at Gettysburg Presbyterian Church. Now, unlike Everett's address, which was distributed to all the loyal newspapers in advance, this speech was never published and remained lost to history for nearly 150 years. I argue that to really understand Lincoln's address, you need to understand all 3 of these speeches as a rhetorical ensemble, if you will. The Gettysburg memorial ceremonies were not only about honoring the Union dead, this was the most important political event for the Lincoln administration since the election of 1860. Now, it might surprise you that the man chosen to wrap up the day's events, Charles Anderson, was a lifelong political opponent of Lincoln. He was also a Texas slaveholder in 1861. So how this man ended up sharing the spotlight with Lincoln and Everett on such an important day in the middle of the Civil War is a story so unusual, one noted Lincoln scholar called it a Civil War Forrest Gump. So today what I'd like to do is share highlights of this incredible odyssey that led Anderson to Gettysburg. I'll then talk about why I think the speech was important. But before I do any of that, I'd like to start with the discovery of the speech manuscript itself, because that story begins in a most unusual place.
And David, if I could just interject briefly here, there's this little orange box that keeps kind of appearing on the screen. I wasn't sure if you knew what that was about.
Yeah, it says, please move it away from the application. How's that? Oh, that's better, actually.
That is better.
Okay. Are you seeing the UR screen sharing in the middle?
Yeah, it's still there, but it is substantially smaller. I don't know if you can move it to like the bottom left or bottom right or something.
I'm trying to do that. It just keeps advancing.
Yeah, sorry, just that I didn't want that in the frame the whole time.
Yeah. Let's see. I'm trying to click it and drag it here.
The wonders of technology.
I know. I apologize.
Maybe exiting out of the PowerPoint would make it easier, perhaps.
We can do that.
Yeah, bear with us, everyone.
I'm going to stop the share and actually share and go ahead and share again.
Yeah.
Okay.
That will probably do it.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure what that was, but it seems to be gone now. And sorry. Oh wait, no. Now now there it is again.
There, it's gone.
It keeps kind of fading in and out.
Gee whiz. Okay, I'm going to try to. Yeah. Okay. All right. All right. Looks like it's.
Yes. Well.
Let's just leave it at the top there.
Yeah. That's it's a little bit smaller and more out of the way. So anyway, carry on. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's okay. So about 20 years ago, an anthropologist from Indiana University, his name is Rob Tolley. He was conducting a mountaineering expedition with his students in the Wind River mountain range outside of a little town in Wyoming called Pinedale, which is the red dot on the map. So after 3 weeks of eating nothing but freeze-dried food, these hardy explorers emerged from the wilderness with just one thought on their mind. Where can I find the best steaks in town? And locals directed them to this guest ranch. It's called the Fort William Guest Ranch. It's about 6 miles out of town. And here, Rob and his students met these fine folks. The man on the left is Bartley Skinner, the great grandson of Charles Anderson, and his wife, Rose, who was the mayor of Pinedale. So Rob made annual treks to Wyoming with his students, became great friends, almost like family with them. And one day when Rob was visiting, 8 large cardboard boxes arrived via UPS. Of course, we know UPS goes everywhere. And inside these boxes, let me tell you, was a historian's dream. There were hundreds and hundreds of Anderson's letters, 3 diaries, his part of his library with pencil notations in the margins of the volumes, photographs, everything you would want to have to tell the story of a man's life. And Bartley was getting rather on at this time. His eyesight was failing. So he asked my friend Rob to take charge of these artifacts, identify them, and then prepare to donate them to various archives across this country. And that's when the anthropologist became the accidental historian. So Rob toiled for years trying to identify these artifacts. Many of us know how easy it is to read 19th century handwriting. And there was one item in particular that really puzzled him, and it was this item here. And it was only after Rob had arranged to donate this to the Ohio Historical Society in Columbus that further research revealed that this indeed was the long missing manuscript of Anderson's speech at Gettysburg. So, who was Charles Anderson? How in the heck does he end up at Gettysburg? Well, Anderson was the brother of someone I'm sure many of you have heard of. His name was Major Robert Anderson, who surrendered Fort Sumter. And they were both the sons of someone you've probably never heard of. But he was an important figure in the Revolutionary War, and his name was Richard Clough Anderson. As you can see, Richard Clough Anderson was aide-de-camp to Lafayette. He was a confidant of Washington. He was made surveyor of the bounty land grants for the Revolutionary War veterans after the war in both Kentucky and Ohio. So he didn't get married until after the war was over at 37 years old, still managed to have 18 children. The last child born when he was 71 years old. And his youngest son was Charles. And Charles attended, he was born in 1814, and he attended Miami University in Ohio, which was really on the edge of Indian country at this time. And as was customary for the top graduates, he would give a commencement speech to his peers. You can imagine them cringing when he read the title of this speech. But what this address was really was a plea for an erection of a monument to the nation's greatest hero. Now, who is the nation's greatest hero in 1833? Of course, George Washington. Let me read you just a few little snippets of what this 19-year-old whippersnapper envisioned as his idea of what the Washington Monument ought to look like. He said it should be, quote, simple, towering, sublime, and resemble, quote, the obelisks of fallen Egypt. So how did this young man envision the precise aspect of a monument that was not even designed for another 3 years? Well, we don't know for sure, but Anderson's mother was named Sarah Marshall. Sarah Marshall just happened to be the first cousin of someone else you've heard of. His name was Chief Justice John Marshall, and Chief Justice John Marshall happened to be the chairman of the design committee for the Washington Monument that first met just 3 weeks before the Miami graduation. So obviously I have no proof that Charles sat around the fireside with Uncle John talking about this prospective Washington Monument, but it does show you how close these elite political circles were at this time. So Anderson becomes a successful attorney in Dayton, Ohio. And in 1846, he's elected to the Ohio State Senate, and he serves one term, and here's why. The first thing he does when he gets on the floor of the Ohio State Senate is he makes an argument for doing away with the black laws of Ohio. Now, if you're not familiar with these laws, these are laws that are intended to circumscribe the behavior of free blacks in the North. You had to register your occupation, you had a curfew, you had to have proof that you were not an escaped slave, all things, frankly, to discourage other blacks from settling in the neighborhood. Later in 1849, he made probably his best speech of his career. And many of you have probably read the book by Jared Diamond called Guns, Germs, and Steel. Well, this is Guns, Germs, and Steel about 150 years ahead of his time. Anderson is making a very unusual argument here that the Anglo-Saxon race, if you will, is a myth and blacks are not genetically inferior. This is a very unusual argument for a white intellectual to make at this time. So by this time, Anderson is doing quite well in his law practice. He moves to Cincinnati, the Queen City of the West, and he builds this mansion at the corner of Pike and Fifth. It's not there anymore. There's a freeway there. It's near the Taft Art Museum, if you're familiar with Cincinnati, and things pretty well for Mr. Anderson at this point. There's only one problem. He has asthma. There's no cure for asthma at this time. So when he's not practicing law or out fishing, he spends a lot of time in bed. And in 1857, he picks up a book by this man, Frederick Law Olmsted, who we all know as the father of American landscape architecture. What you may not know about Olmsted is before he did this, he spent 6 years as a newspaper correspondent documenting the slave economy in the South. And let me read you just a few snippets from how Olmsted described the town of San Antonio, which was a town another newspaper correspondent just a few years earlier had called, quote, a dirty mud hole. But here's how Olmsted describes San Antonio. The San Antonio River is of a rich blue and pure as crystal. Its spring in a wooded glen north of town may be classed as the first water among the gems of the natural world. The river is of such incredible beauty that you cannot believe your eyes and almost shrink from sudden metamorphosis by invaded nymphdom. And Anderson, this intelligent attorney, buys this lock, stock, and barrel. He sells that beautiful mansion, abandons his law practice, and moves to Texas in 1859. Now, as we know in retrospect, 1859 is probably not a great time to be moving to Texas if you're a strong Union man like Anderson. But don't let anyone tell you that there were not a lot of Union supporters at Texas at this time. For example, in August of 1859, Sam Houston is elected governor over a secessionist incumbent. But of course, in October, an event happens at Harper's Ferry that changes everything. We all know what that is, John Brown's raid. If you read the newspapers, diaries, letters of the time, you can see a dramatic shift in Southern public opinion back toward disunion after that event. So back home in Ohio, Charles's friends and family know that he has made a terrible mistake by moving his family to Texas. They're politically very well connected, so they arranged for Anderson to be nominated by the Buchanan administration for Assistant Secretary of State. This is quite a plum position, which Anderson turns down twice, a rather bonehead move on his part. In July of 1860, things get much worse. Anderson owns 2 slaves. One of his slaves, a boy named Dan, is found murdered and dumped in the San Antonio River. And later that same month, temperatures in North Texas reach 110 degrees, fires break out, and several towns burn to the ground. And newspaper editors blame these fires on a supposed conspiracy between Blacks and abolitionists. And this creates a wave of violence across Texas that has been rather euphemistically called the Texas Troubles. So the 1860 election comes along, and Anderson decides to support John Bell and Edward Everett of the Constitutional Union Party. And here's what Anderson said about the 1860 election. Anything to defeat Lincoln and almost anything to defeat Breckinridge. Anderson feels like the election of either of these sectional candidates is a sure recipe for disaster, and disaster in Anderson's mind equates to disunion. So of course, when news of Lincoln's election reaches San Antonio, which again is out on the frontier, Anderson just happens to be in town buying supplies on the day that the secessionists call for a public meeting to decide on next steps in the wake of this momentous event. Anderson's Union friends convince him to stay in town and speak at this meeting. Well, he's not on the agenda. He certainly has not prepared a speech, but Anderson does speak. He delivers a rousing defense of the Union, nearly creates a riot. This speech is transcribed and published by the incoming Lincoln administration, 6,000 copies, wallpapered all over the North, and Anderson becomes a national figure really for the first time. Now, 3 days after this Alamo meeting, in a move that was orchestrated by Secretary of War John Floyd, who might be one of the greatest traitors in American history, this man on the right, the ill and all but retired General David Twiggs, is asked by Floyd to retake his command of the Department of Texas over this man in the middle, Robert E. Lee, who had temporarily replaced him. In the meantime, if Floyd is encouraging Southern governors to take hold of federal arms and munitions, and militias are starting to drill, there's quite a conspiracy going on here. A week later, this man on the left, old Fuss and Feathers, Winfield Scott, commander of all US forces, he has developed a secret plan, which we're now all familiar with. It's called the Anaconda Plan. So Winfield Scott has decided that he is going to send this plan to Charles Anderson in Texas and ask him to share the plan with both David Twiggs and Robert E. Lee. Because remember, at this point, we don't know where these people's sympathies are going to lie. So Anderson gives the Anaconda Plan to Twiggs first, and here's what Twiggs says. "It is damn strange that General Scott should have sent the papers to you. But I know General Scott fully believes that God had a spit on his hands to make Bob Lee and Bob Anderson. And after all, you are Major Anderson's brother." When Anderson visits Lee to retrieve these same papers, Lee begs him not to have them published for fear that this might create the impression that the federal government intended to take some type of preemptive military action against the Southern states. It is also at this moment that Robert E. Lee decides to confide in Anderson before he had to anyone else that if Virginia secedes, he would go with his state. So as you may know, Twiggs surrenders US forces to a band of approximately 1,000 armed Texas citizens on February 16th, 1861. This happens to be the same day that Robert E. Lee was returning from one of the remote Texas outposts. So picture this. Lee rides into town. He has no idea that essentially a military coup has just taken place. He's surrounded by the secessionists, and Lee is told that unless he resigns his commission immediately and joins this rebellion, he would not be able to ship his personal goods back east to Virginia. Lee replies that he has no obligation to an illegal gang of revolutionaries, so he asks Charles Anderson to take charge of his belongings until they could be shipped back east. So Anderson and Lee are walking to the commission merchant in San Antonio when Lee reiterates this decision he had told Anderson about just a few weeks previously, and here's what Robert E. Lee said. "I still think, as I told you and Dr. Edwards, that my loyalty to Virginia ought to take precedence over that which is due to the federal government. I shall so report myself to Washington. If she stands by the old Union, then so will I. But if she secedes, though I do not believe in secession as a constitutional right, nor that there is sufficient cause for revolution, I will still follow my native state with my sword, and if need be, with my life." Now, Anderson, this strong Southern Union man, feels compelled to respond. So here's what Anderson says in response to Lee. "The selection of the place in which we were born was not an act of our own volition. But when we took that oath of allegiance to our government, that was an oath of manhood, and that act we cannot break." Lee then replied, "I know you think and feel very differently, but I can't help it. These are my principles, and I must follow them." Those were the last words the two friends ever spoke to one another. So, of course, Anderson's brother Robert surrenders Fort Sumter in April. The war has begun. By the summer of 1861, Anderson is still in Texas, trying to help other Union men who are being tarred and feathered or worse. Fortunately for him and other Union men in the South, the Confederate government passes an act. It's called the Alien Enemy Act. And what this act says is that Union men in the now Confederate states have 90 days to get out of Dodge or be subject to persecution, arrest, or worse. So Anderson sells that beautiful mansion, all his stock at a great loss, packs up his family, coincidentally in the ambulance of James Longstreet, who had already left, and they set out. He and his wife and his two daughters set out intending to go to Brownsville, Texas, where they would catch a steamer back up to safety in the north. Well, they get one day out of town when they hear hoofbeats. This man on the left, his name was Henry Eustace McCulloch. He was the brother of the much better known Confederate Brigadier General Benjamin McCulloch, who died at Pea Ridge. Henry Eustace McCulloch is running the show for the Confederates in San Antonio. He has changed his mind, and he's decided that Anderson is far too dangerous to be allowed to leave. So he sends a military detachment of 16 soldiers to round up Anderson, his wife, and his two daughters and drag them back to San Antonio. You imagine how they're feeling after they've said their tearful goodbyes to their friends, and for lack of a better term, imprison them in the Menger Hotel. Now, many of you have probably been to San Antonio. You've certainly been to the Alamo. If you haven't been directly next door to the Menger Hotel, shame on you. This is one of the most beautiful old hotels in the country. For example, was a place where Teddy Roosevelt recruited many of his Rough Riders. So next time you're in San Antonio, check it out. So anyway, so Anderson and his family imprisoned in the Menger Hotel. They take his papers, they take all his money, they interrogate him for 3 days, and then McCulloch reaches a decision. He is going to offer Anderson a parole of honor. Here's what Anderson says to McCulloch's offer of a parole of honor. I would not give my parole for 1 minute to save your soul from hell. McCulloch replies, well, then I will exercise all the kindness and courtesy I can do toward you safely, or that you, in your evident desire to make yourself a martyr, will permit. So McCulloch decides that he is going to allow Anderson's wife and two daughters to travel with a military escort to get down to Brownsville, Texas, but he's going to imprison Anderson in a military camp east of town. So, of course, in the meantime, Anderson's friends are trying to figure out how to spring him from this situation. And let's be clear, escapes from military prisons, particularly early in the war, a very frequent occurrence, right? There's no stockade fencing here. These are tent camps on the outskirts of town. And the whole story of Anderson's escape, which is frankly my favorite part of the book, much too long to tell here, but I will give you a teaser. There were 3 conspirators in this escape attempt. Conspirator number 1, a Union widow woman who barely knew the Andersons, but she was upset that her son had run off to Houston to join the Confederates. She was the one that actually devised this elaborate escape plan. Conspirator number 2, a Belgian astronomer. He's also an abolitionist. This man is certainly in the wrong place at the wrong time. And conspirator number 3, if you can believe it, was the first cousin of the commanding officer of the prison camp. So Anderson does escape. He travels over 400 miles in 11 days. Imagine a network of Union safe houses, almost like Underground Railroad safe houses where he could exchange his horses. So 400 miles in 11 days just to get out of Texas. And then an even longer circuitous route through Mexico, reunites with his family in Brownsville, Texas. They catch a steamer through Havana and they arrive in New York in the very last days of 1861 after nearly 3 months on the run. And Anderson gives an account of this escape to a packed house at Cooper Union, the same Cooper Union where Lincoln had most recently spoken. And here's what the New York Times said about it, quote, "Among the most moving and romantic episodes of the war." So now both Charles and Robert Anderson are national heroes, but there's a problem here, right? Anderson has bankrupted himself in Texas. He has no money, no job. What is he going to do? Well, Governor David Todd of Ohio has an idea. Charles, we would like you to raise a regiment for the Union. Here's another item we found in the cardboard boxes. I apologize for its condition, but this is trading on the now famous Anderson name as a recruiting device. So Anderson agrees to raise a regiment. He's 48 years old, by the way. And in 2 weeks, he recruits more than 900 men. And on August 9th, 1862, Anderson is appointed colonel and commander of the 93rd Ohio Volunteer Infantry. Now, he and his men have basically zero military training. They drill for precisely 1 week and are sent to the front in Kentucky. And unfortunately, Anderson and his regiment are at the focal point of the immediate initial Confederate assault at the Battle of Stones River in Tennessee. Now, as you probably know, this is one of the bloodiest major battles of the war, over 24,000 casualties. Experts on this battle would say this is probably a tactical draw, but perhaps a strategic victory for the Union because the Confederates do end up retreating out of Middle Tennessee. Anderson is wounded twice in this battle and makes a rather miraculous escape from death. And I'm certainly not going to spoil that story for you. But here's another item we found in the cardboard boxes. I was pretty excited to see this. This was in the middle of a letter that's now housed at the Huntington Library out here in California. This is a hand-drawn map by Charles Anderson of the Battle of Stones River. And I sent this to Jim Lewis at Stones River. He was pretty excited to see it because we think this may be now the earliest hand-drawn map of a battle by an actual participant. It's published in my book for the first time. And Anderson was so kind to his future biographer, yours truly, that he actually created a legend and with little spaces so he could show exactly where he was wounded so I could still tell the story to you properly. So I bought this picture on eBay. This is my favorite image of Anderson. And when I first purchased it, I thought this is pretty obvious, right? This is Anderson in his military uniform with a blanket. This must be Anderson recovering from his war wounds, right? Because Anderson not only will always have asthma, and I said he was wounded twice, he also contracted typhoid. So Anderson is forced to resign his commission at that point. The more I thought about this photograph, I'm now convinced that this is not a photograph taken during his recovery. This is actually a promotional photograph for his next escapade. So as many of you know, even by the middle of 1862, people in the North were getting quite tired of this war, right? Everyone thought this was going to be a short conflict. Now, hundreds of thousands have been maimed or killed. And there's so much war weariness in the North that the Republicans are trounced in the midterm elections of 1862 in the states in the North. So much so that they decide to jettison the Republican Party name, form a coalition with war Democrats. These are the Democrats that actually support the war, and rebrand themselves in today's parlance as the Union Party. So the Union Party has a big problem in Ohio in 1863, and here is the problem. This man, Clement Vallandigham, the leader of the Peace Democrats, or more disparagingly, the Copperheads, he is speaking out strongly against the war, calling it a mistake, discouraging enlistment, so much so that Ambrose Burnsides, the commander of the Department of Ohio at this time, decides on his own to arrest Vallandigham in the middle of the night at home in his night clothes and drag him away to be placed before a military tribunal where he is convicted of treason and sentenced to a long prison term. Let's just say that President Lincoln is none too happy with this action, because what Burnside has done has actually created a martyr for the anti-war cause. So Lincoln decides to commute his sentence on one condition, and that be that Vallandigham be dropped off behind enemy lines. Believe me, Vallandigham does not want to be in the South. Jeff Davis wants nothing to do with this man. He is poison. So Vallandigham makes his way to Wilmington, where he hops on a steamer and ends up a refugee in Canada. And it is in Canada where this convicted traitor is nominated overwhelmingly, something like 166-7, by Ohio Democrats as their candidate for governor of Ohio in 1863. Now, the Union Party is forced to respond. The Union Party decides to nominate railroad executive John Brough. He's a war Democrat. He's a great candidate. There's only one problem with Brough. His prosperity has so increased his waistline. This man weighs nearly 400 pounds at this point. He is in no shape to go on the stump and campaign for governor of Ohio. And of course, the Democratic candidate, he's not even allowed back in the United States. He's up in Canada. So this is the most unusual election that is actually waged by the two candidates for lieutenant governor of Ohio. The Democrats decide to nominate Mexican war hero George Pugh, tall, handsome, terrific choice. The Union Party responds by nominating newly minted hero Charles Anderson as their candidate for lieutenant governor. Anderson barnstorms all over Ohio, makes something like 36 speeches in 42 days. Ohio wins by more than 100,000 votes, which was the largest margin of victory in the history of Ohio electoral politics at this time. And Lincoln wires Governor David Todd, "Glory to God in the highest. Ohio has saved the Union." Now, as you may know, at this time, not all of these state elections occurred on precisely the same date like they do now. So at this point, Pennsylvania had not voted for governor. New York had not voted for governor. So they asked Anderson to go out and campaign in these states for the Union Party. He refuses. Here's what he says: "I am and expect to be neither a Republican nor a Democrat. The one is not better than the other." So this brings us to Gettysburg. This is a rather famous photograph of part of the Gettysburg National Cemetery under construction. And the Ohio delegation has planned a meeting for the afternoon following the cemetery dedication. And of course, Ohio in 1863, as it is in 2021, a critical state in national politics. So Governor Todd needs a keynote speaker for this event. So he asked Charles Anderson to be the keynote speaker at this event, which would be attended by Lincoln, Seward, all the important people. This is a fiery political event with content that is certainly not appropriate for a battlefield consecration. So they decide to hold it at the Gettysburg Presbyterian Church. This is how it looked in 1863. It certainly doesn't look like that anymore. There's a 3-story brick edifice on this spot now. There is still a pew inside, the original pew that says Lincoln sat here. Of course, nothing about my man, Charles Anderson, but this is really supposed to be Anderson's big moment, right? Well, a 70-year-old farmer and self-made legend by the name of John Burns steals the show. Now, if you don't know the story of John Burns, this farmer was supposedly the only man who stayed in town to defend the town. He brought down, I don't know, 4, 7, 14 Confederates, who knows how many Confederates. The legend grows each time Burns himself tells the story. And so picture this. The meeting is already underway. Lincoln and Seward are walking in, and between them, John Burns, with his cane, arm in arm with Lincoln and Seward, walking into this meeting, upstaging my man, Charles Anderson. However, we now have Anderson's entire speech printed for the first time. It's in an appendix in the back of my book. It's probably not as exciting reading as the rest of the book, but what I'd like to do is just share with you a few things about what Edward Everett said and what Charles Anderson said at Gettysburg, because we all know what Lincoln said, right? We had to memorize it in school. So let's start with the Union dead. Here's what Edward Everett, one of the most famous men in America, they put off the entire ceremony for a month just so he could be the keynote. Here's what Edward Everett said about the Union dead. I feel as never before how it was truly, it was said of old, that it is sweet and becoming to die for one's country. Now, when Anderson talked about the dead in his speech, he really wanted revenge. Here's what Anderson said about the Union dead. The dead must have justice at their own graves. Their blood cries out from all this beloved ground to all these heavens above, and God has heard that cry. Now, of the Southern people, here's what Edward Everett said about the Southern people in his speech. There is no bitterness on the part of the masses. The weary masses of the Southern people are yearning to see their dear old flag again flying above their capitals. Now, Everett is a very intelligent man, but he's living way up there in northern New England. Not so sure he's really closely in touch with Southern public opinion at that time. Anderson, in contrast, feels the Southern people have been duped. And here's what he says. The wicked purposes of vile and desperate politician traitors have overruled the good dispositions and infatuated and misguided the honest impulses of the people. So clearly, Anderson is placing the blame for this great American tragedy on the Southern leaders. So let's see what Everett says about the Southern leaders. He is surprisingly conciliatory. Here's what he says. This is Everett. There is no personal bitterness felt, even against them. They may live in safe obscurity beneath the shelter of a government they have sought to overthrow. Well, as you might imagine by now, Anderson had a little different spin on the Southern leaders. He was pretty angry. Here's what he said. Yet bloodier retribution awaits. Nay, now falls upon those wretched men whose crime neither the earth can hide nor the seas can cleanse. These men were cultured into morbid activities and pampered at last into insane, parasital, suicidal arrogance. So Anderson is really mocking the Southern aristocrats as corrupt leaders who were, quote, born into the inheritance of unjust power, nurtured by the milk of slaves and slavery, rocked in their cradles by servile hands. Well, incidentally, Anderson himself, he was also rocked in his cradle by servile hands. The Democrats are also playing on racial fears that a general emancipation would deluge the North with a flood of blacks, lowering wages, creating a huge pauper class. And Anderson, like Lincoln earlier in his presidency, favors gradual abolition. Here's what he says. This is Anderson. It seems to me better for us to bear with slavery in its unquestionable constitutional rights than for us to press this cruel war for other ends of doubtful, perhaps vain benevolence. But slavery in an adjacent foreign state must be crushed without respite. So for Anderson, this is not a popular revolution from the ground up. This is a power grab by evil demagogues intent on destroying God's plan for the nation. And to make this point, Anderson faces Lincoln and Seward sitting right there in the front pew and says this: "Let them seize and destroy our national city, its wood into ashes, its marble into sand. Let them imprison, hang, burn our president and all the heads and hands of the departments. Yet we are still a nation. Foreign monarchy must understand, and domestic oligarchy must relearn that our national being flows on forever in a stream of moral principles and not through any chain of written deeds or printed charters." So I imagine Lincoln and his cabinet members might have been squirming in their pews as Anderson is painting this macabre scene, but the audience is cheering wildly. Near the end of the speech, perhaps Lincoln grinned when Anderson said this: "Here then was the first and only fair trial of self-government, of a government of the people, for the people, ever made on earth." Sound familiar? Well, this famous phrasing was not a Lincoln invention, of course. It was probably first used by transcendentalist preacher Theodore Parker, later used by Daniel Webster. So Anderson is hardly this Lincoln supporter, but I think it gives both men comfort that they're on the same page as far as their devotion to preserving the Union. So the speech is a big hit. Lincoln and Seward congratulate Anderson on his fine effort. Anderson actually rides back on the train with a very ill Lincoln back to Washington. Ohio orders that this speech be printed. Never happened. Remember, I told you that Everett's speech, 2 hours long, distributed to all the loyal newspapers in advance. It took up so much room in the loyal papers of the day, there's simply no room for Anderson's speech. When Anderson is asked to produce this speech 30 years later, he can't find it. So the Gettysburg dedication was not only a memorial, it was a carefully crafted political event designed to help kick off Lincoln's 1864 re-election campaign. Never in the course of his presidency had Lincoln left Washington solely for the purpose of participating in a public event. Now, many of the key Union Party operatives were there too, giving impromptu speeches on the night before the dedication. Opposition newspapers chastised the president and his allies for turning a somber and solemn event into what the Ohio paper The Crisis called an insensate carnival. Now, to be fair, there was plenty of serenading, merrymaking, and drinking going on the night before this dedication. The Philadelphia Age cried that, quote, "The country should blush with shame. These men meet to laugh and joke and electioneer with the wounded still groaning and the dead unburied." Despite this criticism, Lincoln and his allies knew that this was an important political moment, and they were prepared to leverage it with as much dignity and grace as possible. So the three principal speeches on the day of the dedication operated as a rhetorical ensemble. Each had a distinct political purpose. Everett's purpose, of course, was to educate, gives a blow-by-blow description of the battle, interviews generals on both sides. So he's focused on the past. Lincoln, of course, he paints this inspirational picture for what the future renewed nation would look like. Anderson's job is to motivate, or I would say even agitate, his audience back into a vigorous prosecution of Lincoln's war agenda at a time when many in the North are calling for an armistice. So you've honored the dead soldiers with Everett. You've painted this glorious picture of what the future would look like with Lincoln. Now you need to finish the job. Many of us have read Doris Kearns Goodwin's Team of Rivals. Well, Everett ran against Lincoln on the ticket in 1860. And as you've heard, Anderson never supported the president politically, but Lincoln was quite comfortable in such an ensemble. And here's what Lincoln said: "I am willing to receive any man or class of men who will help us even a little." So Lincoln is this master politician who in this instance is using both of these men's speeches to bookend his remarks so he can appear to rise above the political fray and speak from inspiration. Remember, I told you and you heard that Everett's speech was really conciliatory toward the South. This allows Lincoln to paint this picture of reunion with reconciliation. But as to the equally important task of actually winning the war, Lincoln is constrained by the solemn context of a cemetery dedication. So he has to ask his audience to read between the lines when he says unfinished work and the great task remaining. So Lincoln asks his audience to take increased devotion to that cause and then leaves it for Anderson to really spell it out for him. So Lincoln's political allies knew exactly what they were getting when they chose Anderson to wrap up the day's events. And Ohio's importance in the upcoming presidential election of 1864 could hardly be overemphasized. So Lincoln is trying to court favor with as many Ohio politicians as he can. Well, where else can Lincoln find a border state Union man who had escaped from a Confederate prison, been wounded on the battlefield, and then helped defeat the most notorious Copperhead in the North? But as Anderson showed in his remarks on emancipation in his closing address, despite his impressive credentials and despite his powerful skills of oratory, this man is really a loose cannon. So Lincoln uses him after the Alamo speech. He uses him again at Gettysburg, but he soon distances himself from Anderson. And frankly, that is just fine with Anderson. So the 1864 election comes along, and Anderson is asked to go out and campaign for Lincoln. What do you think he says? No way. Listen to what he says. As for Mr. Lincoln, he might well attempt to row up the Niagara chute in a particularly frail birch bark canoe with a particularly weak feather for a paddle, as the talk about abolishing slavery as a condition for reunion. It is a cruel duty to declare against my own political friends, but it is my duty. So we fast forward to June 1865, back in Ohio. Big Governor John Brough is ambling across the Ohio State Yard when he trips, falls, sprains his ankle, develops gangrene, and dies. Anderson becomes governor of Ohio, a position that I assure you he never aspired to. And in his brief stint as Ohio's chief executive, Anderson does his best to alienate the few political friends he has left by coming out strongly against giving newly freed slaves the franchise. To top that off, in the election canvass of 1866, when he's again a private citizen, Anderson lashes out at the radicals in the Congress, calling them, quote, traitors to their principles. He complained that, quote, they fought a war while denying there was ever any secession, then passed laws and amendments while 11 of the 36 states were disqualified from participating. In following the lead of the Congress, they are plunging us into another civil war. And I feel quite certain that Anderson viewed Reconstruction as another civil war. So the Union was saved, But Anderson no longer felt comfortable living in the North, so he retires back to Kentucky, where he spent the last 30 years of his life fading into historical obscurity. But at Gettysburg, both Everett and Anderson have their last important moments, allowing Lincoln the statesman to inspire a nation, while Lincoln the politician assembles a winning coalition. Thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed the program. And I don't know, Matt, if you had any questions, but I'd be happy to answer them.
Well, first off, David, fantastic presentation. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. This was a really interesting topic, and the way you presented it was very concise and compelling. So thank you for that. John, how are we looking for questions? I've got a few myself.
Yeah, we got a few people chiming in the comments. Eddie McDevitt, member and supporter of the museum, says, need to read your book and hear the fascinating story of the escape. And actually, before I get to his question, well, I think you might have it pulled up there. What actually is the title of your book?
Yeah, so the title of the book is The Lost Gettysburg Address, Charles Anderson's Civil War Odyssey. And like you can see here, it's $23 delivered. You can hit my website and send me a check. I also have a brand new book, the biography of August Willich, called Radical Warrior, and that's the commercial for that one. So, but I'm really interested in the questions.
Yes, he says about the escape. How did he know how to find Union supporting safe houses?
That's a great question, and that we don't know. I mean, we know generally that there were pockets of Union sympathizers all over Texas. If you think of the hill country near San Antonio in particular, and the Germans, there were some German citizens of San Antonio that were somewhat involved also in this escape attempt. So there are many Union sympathizers throughout Texas. So it's not too difficult to know who these men are and these families. And by the time Anderson escapes, there have already been a lot of refugees, if you will, fleeing Texas. So this network of safe houses is already set up. Do we know precisely who they are? We know where some of them are, but we don't know precisely who they are. It's almost like tracking espionage in the Civil War, right? It's a very difficult thing to do because it was kept secret. But we do know some things, and more of these stories are coming to light every year. There's a lot that is left to be done on Union supporters in Texas, for example. So great question.
A couple comments. One from a friend of the museum, John Willen. He mentions that Anderson's nephew, Nicholas Longworth Anderson, was also wounded at Stones River.
That's correct.
Great little tidbit there.
Yeah, I think there were 7 in that family overall that served. Yeah.
Oh wow, that's pretty impressive number. Mm-hmm. And then Derek Rupert adds, didn't know any of this. Great video. So the critics rave.
Thank you.
That's all we got in the comments for now. Go ahead, Matt, with some of your questions.
Sure, David. The address itself, the speech at Gettysburg, you laid out a pretty good, a very good, idea that Lincoln knew exactly who he was working with in regards to both Everett and Anderson. But do we have any correspondence between Anderson and Washington prior to the speech?
Yeah, so I get this question a lot, and there's a couple different answers. First of all, this event was organized by the loyal governors of the state, along with David Wills, of course. But Anderson was invited, I think, about a month before the event. Lincoln was formally invited only a couple weeks before the event. Wasn't even sure that Lincoln was going to attend. If he didn't attend, actually Seward was going to give that brief address, and it would have been a much more radical address from Seward than it was from Lincoln. But the argument that I'm making here is that Lincoln is taking advantage of this situation. Lincoln did have a copy, a rather large copy of Everett's speech before it was delivered. So when Lincoln was preparing his speech, he also could use Everett's speech as a reference. There is no evidence to suggest either that Lincoln had a copy of Anderson's speech before, nor that there was any collaboration. So the argument that I'm making is this is actually Lincoln in the moment taking advantage of this situation. He knows Anderson quite well. He knows what to expect, right? This is a political rally intended to now that we've had the dedication, we need to get people back on the bandwagon in terms of supporting this war. And so that's his purpose. So despite the fact that they're not friendly, and there's some other things in the book that you'll see that they're not friendly at all. For example, Anderson is asked to give the eulogy over Lincoln's body in Columbus, and he refuses. So there's no love lost between these men yet. Lincoln, like I said, is quite comfortable in collaborating with these folks. So Lincoln is making last minute changes. There's a great book by Martin Johnson called Writing the Gettysburg Address, which is a forensic deconstruction, if you will, of the moments and weeks leading up to Lincoln's address, and it really implodes a lot of the old myths, like writing on the back of the envelope on the train and all that jazz. So that's a terrific work. But Lincoln is in the moment. He's making changes even the morning of the dedication after he reviews the battlefield. He's making these last minute changes, inserting God into his speech, for example. And so Lincoln is using this moment to take these two men's speeches and kind of bookend his remarks. So it flows right into what he's trying to do. But as far as active collaboration, Lincoln not only is not really active at all in planning this event, but there's no like strategy of the three getting together and corresponding and say, okay, you say this and I'm going to say this, but it happens beautifully.
Excellent.
Another question from the comments here. John Wellen asks if we know what Lincoln's reaction was to Anderson's speech. I guess maybe you spoke a little bit to that in the sense that, he had a copy of it in advance of the event, but anything you want to say on that?
Well, he didn't have a copy of Anderson's speech in advance. He only had a copy of Everett's speech.
I see.
And all we know for a fact is that that he shook his hand and congratulated him. Beyond that, we don't know. And frankly, Lincoln not only has a lot bigger fish to fry at this point, so he's probably, he hears this fiery speech in defense of his war agenda, and that's what he expects to hear. So. And plus, he's got a version of smallpox at this point, so he's very sick when he leaves. So we have no record of the reaction of Lincoln to Anderson's speech other than he congratulated him.
Gotcha. And then another comment here. Michelle says, "Just bought the Kindle edition of the book." This
oh,
awesome
that's right. There is
table
a Kindle edition. I try not to give the 800-pound gorilla too much business, but yeah, the Kindle edition is definitely out there. So thank you for that.
Excellent. David, I had another one for you. In
Sure.
regards to emancipation, Lincoln has already moved pretty extensively away from his earlier thoughts on emancipation, gradual emancipation. Of course, by November, it's 10 months after the proclamation has gone.
That's right. That's a great question.
And yet, Anderson is bold enough in his speech to still be advocating a more gradual emancipation. And Lincoln had Seward with him, who was really abolitionist.
Yeah, exactly.
Do we know any sort of reactions, if not from the presidential party, then perhaps some of the abolitionist papers that Seward would have been very aware of and possibly even feeding information to, what their thoughts on Anderson was and his comments?
Yeah, well, like I said, there's nobody has a copy of the speech right after the event. So the only people that would have been able to react were the press, and there were some press reactions to Anderson's speech, and there were small little snippets of the paraphrases and of the speech printed, but nothing really extensive. One of the of course the loyal papers supported Lincoln's address and thought Anderson's, some said, oh, Anderson's speech was the speech of the day. And of course, the Democratic papers were very critical. One of them called, Anderson an abolitionist. Well, I have to tell you, Anderson, even though he supported, as I mentioned, doing away with the black laws, even though he did not feel that blacks were genetically inferior, he hated the abolitionists just as much as he hated the secessionists, because he thought they were both equally responsible for this disaster that had befallen the nation. So Anderson is certainly, and at this time there are, there's still Missouri and Kentucky and Maryland. There are still states that are not in the Confederacy that still hold slaves. And, so the amendments, the Reconstruction amendments have not, passed at this point. So some of the Southern Unionists, like Anderson, feel like perhaps gradual emancipation is the way to go in those states. The horse is already out of the barn, right, in Confederate states. So that's a done deal. We know that slavery is going to be abolished, or not in fact, but is on its way to being abolished in those states. We don't know that about the border states. And remember, the border states are really, and particularly Kentucky, are a very serious concern for Lincoln at this time. At one point, and I think in 1862, he says to lose Kentucky is to lose the whole game. So Lincoln has to be careful about that. He's certainly not going to endorse Anderson's stance publicly, but I'm not sure that he would have slapped his hand either in saying that.
Gotcha.
So that's my take on it.
Right.
That's it in the comments. Nothing. Well, Eddie McDevitt chimes in. Ankle sprain leading to death. That is quite unusual.
That's pretty
definitely stands out.
But with someone that big, it was probably a pretty bad sprain. So
yeah, it was, and he lingered for a long time, and it was kind of a gruesome end for a really brilliant man. So it was unfortunate.
Well, John, if we're good, then I want to thank everybody for joining us this evening. Again, David, thank you for joining us. It's been a pleasure having you.
Yeah, likewise.
Again, folks, check out the Lost Gettysburg Address for more on this topic. It's certainly a fascinating one. I know I'm going to be picking up a copy here in the near future myself. For those of you who are thinking on joining us next month, we will be starting a little bit earlier to accommodate one of the speaker. We will be starting at 6:30, so be looking for some announcements about that just as reminders. But John, did you have anything before we go this evening?
Just thanks for tuning in, and to stay up to date with all the museum and the Roundtable are doing, make sure you subscribe to the National Museum of Civil War Medicine on YouTube and like us on Facebook to stay up to date. With all that, this is Matt, David, and John signing off.